Right. It now gives me a very great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Stephanie Dowrick, who has flown all the way from Darwin to be with us today. For those of us who've been in the feminist movement from the 70s will remember Stephanie was the founder of the Women's Press in London with the name Atala. I'm hopeless with names, I apologise. The theme of this conference is for older women to have a voice, and Stephanie has been giving voice to older women since the days of the Women's Press, publishing important feminist texts and stories. Since then, she's gone on to practicing physiotherapy. No, that's psychotherapy. And has a spot on Life Matters with Geraldine Dood. She was ordained as an interfaith minister by the New Seminary in New York in 2005 and has written many, many books to share her insights. Please join me in giving Stephanie a very warm and Older Women's Network welcome. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to start, of course, with an acknowledgement that we are gathering on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and knowing that where we gather always was, always will be Aboriginal land. I also want to acknowledge elders past and present and emerging, and I'm incredibly delighted and lucky to be able to say that there's a very new elder emerging in our own immediate family, my little First Nations granddaughter, whose name is Lux Loana, which means beautiful light. And I'm very proud to be her grandmother. Her other grandmother, who is herself Indigenous, is called Mimi as her granny name. And I've been a grandmother for 11 years, and my other grandchildren call me Bimmy. So this extraordinary little baby now has a Mimi and a Bimmy, which is very cute. I also want to acknowledge and thank Yumi, who has been so thoughtful and so helpful to me personally, and indirectly and directly to each one of you in arranging for this conference. She has an immense capacity to support other women, and that is, of course, what this organisation is all about. And for many of us, that's what our lives are all about. So where are you, Yumi? Yes, why don't we all have a good look and say thank you. Thank you, Yumi. I also want to say how delighted I am to be with each one of you. I might get to know some of you through the day. And this morning, when I woke up quite early, I thought there are probably about 140 or 145 women in this room. And if we have an average age of, let's say, 70, multiply 145 by 70, and we have an amazing collection of experience right here in this room. Yeah. We also have a lot of knowledge. We have knowledge of heartbreak. We have knowledge of recovery. We have knowledge of steadfastness. We have knowledge of hope, and probably quite a lot of us also have knowledge of despair and recovery from despair. And all of that counts for a very great deal. We could not begin to calculate how many meals we've collectively made, how many children we have collectively raised, cared for, loved, cherished, forgiven, and so on. How many grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and so on and so on. This is traditionally women's work, and it is the most honourable work that human beings can do. The theme of this conference is Older Women's Voices Matter in a Civil Society. And I know that there are a couple of panels coming which will emphasise the more political aspects of that, and why our society markedly lacks civility when it ignores older women's voices or women's voices of any age or girls' voices. But particularly when ageism is so prevalent even among the well-meaning. I know that women's voices need to be not just heard, but actually listened to, comprehended, not trivialized or patronized, and not corralled to talk about nothing except old age. That's a crazy thing, isn't it? I notice it on the drum that there are a lot of women maybe nudging into their 60s who are invited to speak about a whole range of topics. But when you get to be in your 70s or 80s or 90s, you become a kind of exhibit and you're wheeled on to speak only about your specialty area. And of course, this happens to minorities also, including First Nations. You know, we have a view on everything. And if we don't have a view on everything, why not? I also want to talk with you about the personal, the more personal. We always said in the 70s and 80s and 90s, and I think we've even said it quite, like last week, that the personal is intensely political. But we sometimes leave out the personal. Each of us is experiencing being an older woman, and I'm very glad to see that there are some amateurs here who are not yet. Bravo that you're here with us. And we're all amateurs. None of us have experienced this particular day before. We're all new to this particular day. But there are things that have formed us in the way in which we perceive older age and the way in which we're actually experiencing it. And one of the critical learnings is that as we grow older, we have an opportunity to free ourselves more and more from other people's expectations of how we ought to be. If you aren't beginning to free yourself now, you never will. So today is the day. If you are not already free to be entirely yourself, of course considering other people's feelings, but considering most of all, what kind of person do I want to be? What do I stand for? Who am I standing alongside and embracing and supporting? The idea of a voice, by the way, is a lifelong one for me, and we have so much to thank First Nations for really bringing this powerful, potent word to our attention, voice. I grew up in New Zealand. I'm a third-generation New Zealander, where I was definitely considered too tall. I've lost 2 or 3 inches in the last few years. I was tall. I was too tall, too loud, and most definitely too opinionated for a girl. At the same time, I went to a convent school where we were encouraged to excel academically, but not to big note ourselves. I had a mother who was highly educated, a university graduate, and a gifted artist and writer. And I also had 2 grandmothers who willingly and effectively worked. So I was never given the kind of menu of domesticity. I was immensely lucky in that, and nor was that remotely expected. But nevertheless, I was very aware of the limitations of where my voice was welcomed. At the age of 16, I went into the law faculty at Victoria University of Wellington at the time when, almost no girls did law. And it was clear that my voice was not welcome at all, except perhaps to applaud somebody more appropriately suited to the law. So much has changed. So when I left New Zealand as a very young woman, I lived in Israel, I lived in the UK, I lived in Germany, and altogether I lived 16 years in Europe before I came to live in Australia. And it was there, through those experiences, and especially through the women's liberation movement, that I found the beginnings of my voice and began the lifelong process of learning how to use it on the page, how to use it in private, and how to use it within myself, inside myself. What is the voice that you have inside yourself telling you who you are and how you ought to be? This is very, very important. So finding a voice was absolutely central in my co-founding and then working as the first managing director of the Women's Press in London. There's a big story there, a glorious story for another occasion, but we were very much about, as the whole women's movement was about, confronting prejudice, confronting stereotype, confronting limitations on who had a voice, who was entitled to speak, and what they might be allowed to say. So one of the great things about being a feminist publishing house at that time of radical civil rights changes, where everything was being freely interrogated from the point of view of race, of social class, of economic equity, of peace politics. At that time, we were able to interrogate, question what was considered to be natural or inevitable. And the women who came to us to be published knew that they could find their voice to the maximum. They didn't have to moderate it or mediate it through skepticism and, questions as to whether the reading public would actually want this. So I think it's such a big story, but we were in so many ways giving voice to the voiceless. I'm talking about the late 70s into the 80s, and there were still so many who were voiceless. If I tell you that among our authors was Alice Walker, and eventually we published The Colour Purple, and Toni Cade Bambara, and Patricia Grace, and so many other immense writers of colour, you would be shocked to think a small, not financially rich press at all could have such writers, as well as the big feminist saviours like Andrea Dworkin and Susan Griffin and so on and so on. And it was because at that time, publishers and publishing didn't recognize what hunger people had for exactly those voices. I'm also aware, though, that there was quite a lot of idealization that goes on, even of people like me who just somehow were able to stand up and achieve things. And sometimes those idealizations from women towards other women rob our complex humanity. Please be aware of that. Or there is also the fact that some women are granted a very public voice, such as Margaret Thatcher or very recently Liz Truss, And those women serve the establishment extremely well because they give cover to the prejudice that is actually sustaining conservative values. I would say still here in 2022, 2, might still be in 2024, 25, radical women's voices are still very seldom heard in public, especially if it is to interrogate the logic, for example, and this is something I know Yumi also feels strongly about because we are Twitter friends, especially if it's to interrogate the logic, for example, of massive spending on non-existent submarines or already outdated fighter jets, while the actual security of more than 1 million women, men, and children in this country is threatened daily by food and housing insecurity and health insecurity. At the Women's Press, which I co-founded before I was 30, I had all the arrogance and energy and insane, glorious idealism of the radical young. And let me say, I have lost none of it. We very consciously and deliberately published many older women, and I'm going to name some of them. Sylvia Townsend Warner, May Sarton, Barbara Deming, Mary Daly and June Arnold, Marie Cardinal, and of course Alice Walker, whom I've mentioned, who wasn't then old but has since written a great deal about getting older. We interrogated sexism, but we also interrogated ageism, and we are still doing it, each of us here, aren't we? We are still interrogating the prejudices that say old means X, when we know it means A to Z. It means everything. We are individuals as well as a collective. I had a very interesting experience on my public Facebook page very recently. To celebrate my 75th birthday, I put a post on my public page, which any of you can see if you Facebook or not, to say, I am now officially old. And I had a very big response to the page with a great many people assuring me that I wasn't really old. But I am, and I am glad to be, and I am grateful to be. Yes, it comes with its challenges, but every age comes with its challenges. And at least I have a long life experience to meet them. I want to also tell you that when I was 37, I'd just given birth to my second child, and I had them a year and 7 weeks apart, but that's another story too. And my older sister was turning 40, and I felt terribly sorry for her. However, both of us have lived twice as long as our mother did. My mother died in 1955, and some of you were not even born then. So I take this being old as an incredible privilege. In my 40s, when I had 2 children on my own as a single mother, and I also had breast cancer, I wrote a novel, which is no longer in print, but it was called Tasting Salt. I don't know whether any of you have read it, but I had a main character called Cordelia who was in her 70s. And when I came into my 70s, I read that novel with some interest. How did I capture that? And I did capture that. And I did have incredible affection for that character and what she was facing. I'm also going to read you a little statement from Diana Athill. Some of you will have read her books. She was writing well into her 90s, and she died at 101. And she was definitely somebody who was, the word is forthright. So she says about aging, all through my 60s, I felt I was still within hailing distance of middle age. Not safe on its shores, perhaps, but navigating its coastal waters. My 70th birthday failed to change this because I managed scarcely to notice it. But my 71st did change it. Being over 70 is being old. Suddenly, I was aground on that fact and saw that the time had come to size it up. So, each one of you is experiencing what I am saying and what I'm evoking here in your own way. You're hearing it differently according to your own experience. You may be asking yourself some questions that are useful, and I'm going to ask you some questions also later. But I want to speak to you first of all about some facts about not just life quality, but also about life expectancy. Now, my mother died very young of cancer, but there are social determinants that affect whole groups of people in our rich Australia in ways that are quite shocking. So this is a quote now. Residents lucky enough to live in Sydney's Leafy Hills district or on the northern beaches can expect to live the longest of any people in Australia. This is data from the Public Health Information Development Unit at Torrens University. Those living in Castle Hill, Cherrybrook, Glenhaven, Cromer, Collaroy, Narrabeen, Gordon, Pymble and Killara have an average lifespan of 88 years. Got that? 88 years. Meanwhile, in the eastern suburbs, residents have an average life expectancy of around 82 years in Bondi and 85 years in Bondi Junction. I'm not sure why. Those living in Melbourne CBD have the lowest life expectancy among city areas at just 59 years. However, the overall lowest median age nationwide was found in Australia's regional areas of Newman in Western Australia, the APY lands in South Australia, and the remote communities in the Northern Territory. Because I spend significant amounts of time in the Northern Territory, I know that it is children there who suffer third world diseases not seen in the eastern states. For example, bronchiectasis from the age of 12 weeks or so, which blocks up their lungs, or rheumatic heart disease, along with the effects of the key social and moral determinants of health that from the day they are born will predict a longer or much shorter life. My husband, my husband is a pediatrician who's worked in the Territory for more than 40 of his 73 years, and he says bluntly, the answer to longevity is wealth. But let's face it, wealth is nowhere near fairly distributed in our not-so-civil society. And the voices of the old, including women, can sometimes be too loudly heard protecting privilege. The 2019 election was a gruesome example of that, giving baby boomers an extremely bad name. So when we talk about older women's voices being heard and listened to, can we please put in a special plea for radical voices? Voices for positive change and social justice, marginalized voices, especially from First Nations, women of color, women with disabilities, women without property, without so-called status or material wealth, but with the incalculable riches of experience, of kindness, of tolerance, of lessons hard learned. I want to spend my last minutes with you moving to more personal insight still, because it is inside ourselves that we have our own experiences of growing old, or older, or very old. And certainly, we grow a great deal closer to our inevitable death. I am standing in front of you because I am a public figure. But for all the privileges and love I have had for my work and still have, my greatest joy, my deepest commitment in life is to my 2 children, my son Gabriel, my daughter Keziah, my 3 beautiful grandchildren, my late life husband Paul, and his children and grandchildren. And I can't leave out either my older sister, who is the only person on earth who has loved me all of my life. Old age lets me meet you as a whole self. Old age lets you meet you as a whole self. Here are some questions that I will put up on my public Facebook page afterwards, but I just would like you to hear them and just feel which of them matters to you most. And maybe I'll give them to Yumi also to consider. How are you listening to the voices inside your own mind and heart? What do you pay most attention to when you're thinking about yourself as an older woman? What are the stereotypes you believe you are labeled with or restricted by? For many years, I think 10 or so, I did the well-being forums for Breast Cancer Network Australia, a marvelous organization which was founded by a very dear friend of mine called Lynn Swinburne. And I talked often to those women about talking to themselves like a best friend. That when they notice that they're speaking to themselves in a discouraging or disparaging or disrespectful way, bring yourself up short and say, is this how you would speak to your best friend? Because as we get older, we will lose friends. We will drift away because of geography, and we will part finally because of death. We need to know how to nurture and nourish ourselves in order to nurture and nourish other people without depleting ourselves. Are you clear? Are you clear what and who give your life meaning right now? How much time are you giving to what gives your life most meaning? In other words, what are you postponing? Do you know what your greatest joys are, as well as your worst fears? Most of us are very well acquainted with our worst fears. we may be less well acquainted with our greatest joys. I want to ask you, can you speak up on your own behalf as well as on behalf of others? How accepting are you that you are far closer to your dying than to your birth? Might you take some regrets to the end that you have not yet voiced? Might you take some words of love and appreciation to the end that you have not yet voiced? I'm going to finish by reading you a poem from Mary Oliver, a remarkable American poet who died in 2019 in her 80s. When death comes, like the hungry bear in autumn, when death comes and takes all the bright coins from his purse to buy me and snaps the purse shut, when death comes like the measles pox, when death comes like an iceberg between the shoulder blades, I want to step through the door full of curiosity, wondering, what's it going to be like, that cottage of darkness? And therefore, I look upon everything as a brotherhood and a sisterhood. And I look upon time as no more than an idea. And I consider eternity as another possibility. And I think of each life as a flower, as common as a field daisy and as singular. And each name a comfortable music in my mouth, tending, as all music does, towards silence. And each body a lion of courage and something precious to the earth. When it's over, I want to say all my life I was a bride married to amazement. I was the bridegroom taking the world into my arms. When it's over, I don't want to wonder if I've made of my life something particular and real. I don't want to find myself sighing and frightened or full of argument. I don't want to end up simply having visited this world. I want to say, all my life, I was a bride married to amazement. I was the bridegroom taking the world into my arms. Thank you.
Wow. I have to say, some of your questions made me a bit fidgety,
Good.
a bit edgy.
Very good.
Thank you very, very much. And thank you again, what an amazing keynote address. As an interfaith minister, you will note that our gift to you as thanks
Oh, how beautiful.
is
Oh,
made.
that's so beautiful. Thank
It is a Tibetan kata,
you.
which
Oh,
is
that's
given
so beautiful. Thank you.
for denoting compassion and purity of her cause and her years of courage to speak up for all of us. Thank you, Stephanie.